Welcome to the Cyber Center for Biblical Studies. Hi, my name is Herb Bateman. Today we want to review a book entitled Life After Death, The Evidence, by Dinesh D'Souza. And today to introduce this book, we have with us Senior Pastor Mike Hontz from Pleasant View Bible Church here in Northern Indiana to share with us this book. Mike, welcome.
Hi, Herb.
Let's talk about this book. What is the overriding thesis of this work?
So Dinesh D'Souza wears various hats. He's known as a documentary writer for conservative politics, and he was also the president of the King's College in New York for a few years. He dabbles in philosophy, and he's a well-known debater. He debates a lot of atheists in public spheres. And that's kind of how I got turned on to him. I was watching debates on YouTube on topics related to Christianity. And I had heard of Dinesh D'Souza from sort of political things. And when I saw that he was debating Christianity, I was a bit surprised, frankly. I didn't know that was something that he debated. And so when I listened to his debates, I was very much attracted to him. I felt like he did a very good job of articulating his points, making them easy to understand. He took very complex truths and explained them simply. And so that was sort of why I looked into this book, was because of the author. He takes this question of life after death and in sort of response to the atheists of our day who kind of laugh at the idea that there's a life beyond this. They kind of chalk it up to wishful thinking and, imaginary. This sort of helps us feel better about death. And he says, is there a way to look at that question scientifically? Is there any evidence to consider scientifically? Now, he'll say from the very beginning of the book, he doesn't pretend to have a conclusive answer. He doesn't pretend from a scientific standpoint to answer the question conclusively. He can't. It's a thesis that cannot be proven whether there's a life after death on either side of the debate. But what he does is he looks at the question from well-regarded scientific perspectives, namely three of them: neuroscience and what neuroscience can tell us about the possibility or probability of life after death; philosophy, and looks at philosophy throughout the ages as it relates to the question of the metaphysical world and the potential for life after death; and then morality and the innate sense of right and wrong that seems to pervade the universe, and where does that come from, and what might it point to. And so those are sort of the three broad categories that he tries to, as wearing a scientific hat, look at those things through that lens and come to he's starting with the premise that he believes in life after death. Okay, so what spurred you to read this book was just your understanding and knowing a little something about Dinesh. Yes,
D'Souza.
That and one other element.
Okay, what else? What was the other?
Another book that I was reading on apologetics spoke about near-death experiences. Now, maybe you're like me, I hear near-death experiences and I think conspiratory, I think, kind of woohoo, and it doesn't really strike me as a reasonable area of, but I was actually very impressed with some of the evidence that was being presented in another book that I was reading on near-death experiences. Actually, two other books, two separate authors brought the evidence from near-death experiences for life after this one, that I frankly found to be somewhat compelling and easy maybe for us as Christians to dismiss because it doesn't fit the normal category of biblical truth. It's experiential truth, and we tend to be more dismissive of experiential truth that can't be, backed up from Scripture. And so just, one example, this was not from this particular book, but another source talked about a case that was recorded in the USA Today, secular source, about a woman who had a very unique type of surgery where they had to stop her heart and stop her brain from functioning. And so they had her brain hooked up to a machine to show that there was no brain waves They had taped her eyes shut so that it wouldn't have any sensors coming in through that, and likewise plugged up her ears so she wasn't able to hear anything in order to do this surgery. Well, in the midst of the surgery, she claims to have had an out-of-body near-death experience whereby she felt her spirit leave her body, and she observed the procedure from above and was able to describe in vivid detail the instruments that were used on her, the conversations between the doctors, what was taking place. And after the fact, the people that were in the room confirmed, yeah, that's what happened, that's what it looked like, that's where the tools were kept. And they had no explanation scientifically how a woman whose physical brain was not functioning could have absorbed that information. And so there's quite a few examples like that of people who can explain things that aren't explainable through the normal realm of, well, you overheard this while you were sleeping, or you dreamed this. And so when I saw Dinesh D'Souza's name, and I saw that he had a couple chapters where he delved into scientifically the whole question of near-death experiences, those were sort of the two linchpins that attracted me to want to read the book.
Okay. When you think about this, what were some of the other issues that were covered?
So from a philosophical standpoint, he talked about the fact that, the atheists, the modern atheist perspective on the soul is that it doesn't exist. There's no such thing as a soul. There's no such thing as a spirit. And there's no such thing as spiritual realities at all, because it doesn't fit their scientific, naturalistic mold of perspective. And so they're forced to explain away things like emotions, ideas, things that are not physical entities. In some way they're metaphysical, they are spiritual ideas and such, and they basically say, well, they appear to us as non-physical things, but they're really just neurons. Honestly, it's complex, and I can't really explain how they describe it, but they're basically the processes going on in the brain. The physical brain is the mind or the soul. It feels like we have personhood. It feels like we have free will. But the atheists today, the modern approach would say we don't have free will. It's just a collection of atoms and cells in our brain reacting and responding, and we have a perception because of that. And so he deals with the philosophy of all of that. Is that a logical, philosophical approach? And so he looks at the history of philosophy and dualism, which would say that we are made up of a spirit and a physical body, and so the brain interacting with the what at least appears to be spiritual realities of the makeup of a human. And he looks at the neuroscience today that shows the relationship between thought patterns and the physical body, and the interesting thing is both seem to affect each other. He talks about the placebo effect, whereby if a person thinks something is going to heal them and they have positive thoughts, it oftentimes does physically affect them, and the opposite is also true. If they think they've got a disease, their body typically is more likely to respond accordingly. At the same time, the physical brain certainly affects thought processes. You look at something like Alzheimer's disease, where there's a deterioration physically of the brain, and it affects emotions, thought patterns, ideas, attitudes. And so there's an inner working between those things. And yet, he talks about the philosophical evidence that would seem to suggest that we can't just say that they are one and the same, that they seem to be two separate entities. It's not just one and the same. And so there's a lot of heady, complex discussions in the book. I mean, honestly, at least 70% of certain chapters were over my head. I didn't get. He talks about physics and astrophysics and dark matter and elements within the scientific realm that cannot be explained simply from a physical world. And he describes them at least as evidence of a spiritual world out there, as something beyond what we can see and test with our hands and our scientific tools. And so there's chapters that talk about things like that as well.
So there's aspects of this book that are really going to challenge your mental capacity.
Oh, definitely, yeah.
Okay. Is it still worthwhile for a pastor to pick up and read?
I would say yes. I get stretching it. You know, it's outside the typical genre of what most of us as pastors tend to read. I would say, especially if you are interacting with atheists, or if you're trying to help people better have a response to some of the questions and the issues that get raised in our world, where, you know, certain one of the things that he brings out is that so many of these topics, many of the leading atheists just assume their presuppositions are correct. They don't argue for them. They just assume that they're correct, and then they argue from their presuppositions in ways that sort of laugh off the idea of life after death. But they haven't really argued for their presuppositions, and he would make the case that their presuppositions are pretty hard to argue, frankly, that the evidence that is out there seems to argue against it. And so, again, if you are one who's going to enter into that world of interacting with some of those atheistic presuppositions, I think, you know, he sheds a lot of light and clarity on some issues that, in a very thoughtful way, that probably would go left not thought about. You know.
Well, I remember when I was a chaplain, and I dealt with people dying on a regular basis, and oftentimes, even when talking with the nurses, they would tell of stories of patients who would recognize, do you see that angel over there? You know, and even when my mother-in-law died, there's this seeing something beyond the physical. Would you say a book like this would give some further clarification, help, open doors for discussion? How might a book like this be helpful for a pastor who might run into healthcare workers who testify to these type of things and wrestle with life after death? Would this book be helpful?
Yeah, I mean, he makes an interesting point. I don't have the specific statistic written down, but it was more than 50% of doctors, physicians believe in the afterlife. It's the highest scientific field by far. Most of the scientific fields tend to be filled with people who are materialists. No, that's not the right word. Naturalists. They view life through the lens of, you know, science and what can we verify, and if you can't verify it, then we shouldn't believe in it, kind of a mindset. And he doesn't know that this is the reason, but he suspects it's because doctors and nurses are bombarded with people who have had experiences that they share, and when you see how many of them there are, it's more than just a fluke. And you know, he references in his chapter a couple other well-known books that record, you know, over 2,000 cases from all over the world. And the interesting thing is with the near-death experiences is that they're almost all identical. They share a lot of the same facets from people, including people who didn't believe in life after death. It's not just sort of people's minds inventing whatever it is they believed as they almost die. It's, you know, people who were atheists who had a very similar experience to a person who was a born-again Christian. And not all the experiences were good. Sometimes the criticism against near-death experience, I think even Billy Graham said something like, well, everybody has an experience where they meet a loving God and everything's good with them. And he brings out that's not at all true, that almost half of near-death experiences were very negative and very dark and even scary. And, you know, hellish, I think was the word that he used, that a lot of people who had an experience where they felt like they had seen what they described as hell and were very frightened by their experience. So, you know, I think as a Christian, obviously my theology of heaven does not come from near-death experiences. You know, it comes from Scripture, and any experience that I'm going to read about, I'm going to test with Scripture because I believe that is infallible and inspired. But there is something to human experience. You know, the Bible doesn't tell us to deny all experience. We're supposed to test our experiences. And there's a lot of fascinating information to read about from folks and their experiences. Again, I hold them somewhat loosely, but so I think it's a very interesting book, and I think it can provide a sense of hope for people who are dying, and to know that others who have experienced that as Christians have had a pleasant experience.
Okay. Was there anything that you were disappointed in that you wish he had covered?
I mean, the only thing I would say by way of disappointment is that some of the chapters were very hard to really grasp. And so, had I reread them a couple times, maybe it would have been better. But, it is one of those books where you've really got to have your brain turned on.
So don't read it at 9 o'clock at night.
Yeah, definitely. And don't be surprised if you come away sort of not clear on what you read. Some of the chapters, other chapters are, a breeze, but...
Okay. Are there any other books out there that are like this that you think might be helpful for a pastor, or is this something that's a standalone?
He references some other books that he used in his own research, on topics, whether he's dealing with neuroscience or other apologetic books when he's talking about morality and that longing for eternity that seems to be within all of us. But as far as me being aware of one that approaches the question of life after death from an apologetic standpoint, I'm not really aware of one that does it quite like he does it.
Okay. Well, Mike, thank you so much. What an enlightening conversation, and certainly a challenging book. Thank you.
Sure.
And thank you for joining us. And I trust that this might be a book that you might be considering to read, and particularly if you do a lot of chaplain work and you're dealing with men and women that are facing death. Perhaps this might be a book that would be helpful to you. Sounds like a book I wish I was aware of years ago when I was a chaplain. But in the meantime, I trust that you will walk with the King and be a blessing to all those that you come in contact with. Thank you.